I don't think there's a day that goes by where I don't absolutely despise doing line work. So I hope for your all's sake that this video does well, cause if you don't share it around, there will be consequences. Hello and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm your host Spirit, and this video is going to be talking about some tips for how to do clean, solid line work in both a digital and traditional space, with a focus on the former. The big thing to know about line work is that while it is relatively simple, it is very time consuming. Unlike coloring, which tends to take less time with this technique, I found that line work tends to be the biggest time sink, just short of painting everything by hand. The technique I'll be showing here is meant not only to create very clean line work, but also to save you some time down the line when it comes to coloring. A major reason why line work is so time consuming is because if you take the time to make it good, you can ultimately save yourself a lot of time in the coloring and shading phases. A stitch in time saves 9, and preventative measures will make things way easier in the long run. So the first thing to talk about are some of the tools that you can get to make clean line work. There are a few ways to go about it, as well as a few different programs, so I'll tell you what I use as well as some of your other options in case you don't have the same equipment or budget. When it comes to software, Photoshop tends to be pretty bad when it comes to doing clean, proper line work. There is a plugin called Lazy Nizumi, but it is only available for PC users and also costs money to use. The major advantage to this is that if you are a Photoshop user like me, you can keep everything in one program without having to switch over. And the customizability of it will allow you to have way more options than a generic stabilizer tool. Of course, if you are new to digital art, the excessive features will probably end up confusing you and can seem a bit scary. And considering Photoshop's anti-aliasing is kind of garbage unless you change it, I would not recommend this for new artists. A cheaper, free option is Fire Alpaca, and this is the one that I use personally. Fire Alpaca has the advantage of good line stabilizers and control, with over 40 levels of stabilization and generally good crisp anti-aliasing. For those who aren't familiar with anti-aliasing, it's basically how the lines end up looking crisp without having solid pixels. Fire Alpaca is available on both Mac and PC, and it also has an onion skin function for animators. The only thing that I would be aware of is that it doesn't have as many functions as Photoshop, such as saved palettes. However, it is more lightweight than Photoshop and can also export PSD files. I personally use Fire Alpaca in tandem with Photoshop. I would do the sketching and line work in Fire Alpaca because it's faster, then move on to Photoshop for coloring and shading. Paint Tool Sai is also an alternative for this, however I haven't used Sai in years and I honestly don't have much experience with it, so for those who use Sai, let me know what your thoughts are below. Your final options are going to be vector-based programs with functions like Illustrator, Adobe Animate, and anything with a vector pen tool. I've talked about vectors versus raster in the past, but in general the major advantage here is that you can use the pen tools without needing to have a tablet. Especially if you're just starting out, using the pen tool in a software like GIMP will help you create decently clean line work without having to have a tablet or other analog method of doing line work. Of course, you will need to be wary about your line weight and tapering, which is something we'll cover shortly. But in general, if you're wanting to stick to digital methods, this is going to be cheaper, if not slightly more time consuming. The last method I will talk about briefly is doing the line work traditionally and then importing it into the computer. The way I'm talking about this is that if you do your sketch and lines on a piece of paper, you can actually scan them into your computer and then color them digitally. The best way to do this would be to take your line work into a program like Photoshop, set your blending mode to multiply, then color on a layer below it. Multiply in particular tends to remove the white and other lighter shades, and it's also really good for creating bold, dramatic shadows at a reduced opacity. Unfortunately with traditional media, the only way to really do it cleanly is to practice and get better with your coordination. Also, this is just a side tangent, but if you practice with traditional line work a lot, I find your skills with digital will be a lot better as well. So do some traditional work, kids. So where's the actual how to draw part? I'm getting there, calm your tatas. Now then, let's actually talk about line work. In my opinion, there are 4 major ways that you can go about doing line work, and for this demonstration I'll be using my cyborg dragon Leonidas. Note that none of these are better or worse than one another, it all just comes down to personal preference and sometimes the tools at your disposal. I'm also not entirely sure of the actual industry terms, but for me the 4 options are uniform, uniform tapered, dynamic tapered, and dynamic bold. Starting off, we have simple uniform lines. These can be achieved by using the pen tool or turning off pressure sensitivity on your tablet. The major advantage to these is that they are relatively quick and easy to draw. You can make them in Flash, and though they are generally rounded at the ends, they are actually used in some professional cases. Agretzko is a major example with its uniform flash lines. However, a lot of anime tend to use this too. A majority of the time, uniform lines are kept small so your eye is drawn to other details. Admittedly, I find larger, untapered lines to look a bit strange, so if you are going to use uniform lines like these at a bigger size, you will need to figure out a way to stylize them to make it work. The next option is going to be uniform tapered. This is the technique I often use, which mostly involves keeping the same brush while also turning pen sensitivity on. I personally prefer to use this style because it's generally more straightforward, and since I generally lean towards thinner lines, it allows me to maintain detail without having to switch to a smaller brush size. The only exception I make for this is usually for eyes or detail lines, which are done after the main line work is complete. Moving on, we have dynamic variants, which generally involve the use of multiple brush sizes to help emphasize detail. A few notable things about this style is that the more levels of sensitivity you have in your pen, the more control you will have over your line weight. On average, most modern tablets will have about 8,000 levels of pen sensitivity, which is a lot compared to the previous 2,000 or so in my old tablet. For those unfamiliar with it, line weight is when you balance out the thickness of your line work in order to emphasize without washing out the colors or muddying the design. I've seen a lot of younger artists will tend to use overly thick black lines, which can make the design seem rather sloppy. I think the best way to improve this is to practice and find a happy medium, or incorporate colored lines. The best way to do this would be to create a clipping mask over the line layer and color over the line work. This method can be used for making lineless work if you want as well. The last option out of these four is dynamic bold. This uses the same principle as dynamic and uniform tapered, but with bold outlines. Bolder outlines are generally used in cartoonier or comical styles to help a character stand out more from the background. Some examples that come to mind are Fairly Odd Parents, with thinner lines on the inside and thicker lines on the outside. A general rule of thumb with this style is to have anything closer to the camera have thicker outlines while things further away should have thinner outlines. I do want to talk a little bit about tablets as they do play a difference in the efficiency and quality of your line work. Now before I say any of this, let me make it abundantly clear that you do not need a screen tablet or any tablet at all to make digital art. These are simply my observations after several years of drawing. From my observation, screen tablets and larger USB tablets tend to make line work a lot easier. Why is this? Well, from personal experience, I believe the extra control and larger working space is the major factor in play. Especially with screen tablets, the ability to see where your lines are going combined with a larger working space generally allows you more control over your line work and strokes. Unlike sketching, which can generally stay pretty loose, line work tends to require a lot more precision, which can get pretty frustrating if you're working with a big screen and a tiny tablet. I would recommend that if you are using a USB tablet to work either with a screen that's relatively the same size, or try to find a tablet that's going to have good response time in comparison to the size of your screen. I used to use a really tiny 6-inch tablet compared to my 24-inch screen, and frankly it was really frustrating to work with all the details. Anywho, aside from that, I think it's about it for this one. If you guys did like what you saw and have any ideas for future tutorials, please do let me know down in the comments. Also, please share this video around if you thought it was helpful, because YouTube is literally screwing me over and is not pushing my videos out. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Here on the left you'll find the playlist of the rest of my art block tutorials. Here on the right you can find a link to my latest video, and if you liked what you saw and want to see more, please be sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Finally, a big thank you to my patrons such as Max Agir, Rocky Harmony, and Mr. Eden for supporting the show. If you'd like to join them, the link to my Patreon is in the card in the description below.